Hello and welcome to another episode of Steelfur Supremacy, my playlist where I look at competitive Flesh and Blood and how we feel about the meta and things like that. Now that Nationals have started to wrap up and there isn't a calling for a few months, unfortunately, for those of you who aren't aware, the Utrecht calling has been delayed until mid-January, hopefully, though they still haven't confirmed a new date. It is looking like they are trying to get it out in mid-January. And that's kind of where we're going to go. So I'm here. I'm just going to have a bit of a look at the deck lists and the meta that we've just seen from the various national championships. I'm going to talk about a lot of the calls for Briar to be banned or nerfed in some way and how I feel about those. I think it's kind of a big deal that people keep asking for it, but I don't think, necessarily, at least personally, I don't know that I think that Briar should be banned. But, everyone thinks differently about these things, and we'll get into that topic in a little bit. So let's start. So we've got a skirmish season to talk about, I guess, before we dive into the tier list, and that would be kind of good. We have Kingsleys data on who's winning skirmishes, which is quite interesting. So let's just have a quick look at that before we go. Oh, by the way, my graphic designer finished this new background screen, which I'll be using for some of the videos, which I think is really nice. And I'm really happy that he did that. So you'll see some slightly different, nicer pieces on some of these videos that I've been doing, just to give me a bit more, just a bit more of a nicer feel. I know some people have been saying, hey, it would be good if you got more variety in your thumbnails and things like that, and I'm playing to my strengths here, which is talking and not necessarily digital editing, though you will notice my new hero guide, Learn to Play hero guide, which I fully recommend to any new players to have a sort of sit down and have a look if they can't decide what they're looking to play. I fully recommend you send it them that way. Does have some artwork, which another content creator called Kugane from Europe has helped me out with, because he's better at Photoshop and video editing than I am. And I just said, look, can you help me with this? Because I'd really like there to be something nice on this series, so that when a new player comes in, they get that whole experience, I think. So let's just have a bit of a look then. So we've got the Nationals there, which we'll come back to in a minute. We've got callings, of course, but let's just have a quick look at the skirmish first. Because we're kind of expecting to see that the zero cost Briar is just as effective in skirmishes as it is in constructed, because ultimately, a 4-card hand, a 5-card hand can present over half the damage of a skirmish, blitz player's life in that short amount of time. And we do kind of see that quite a few zero cost Briar decks are in fact winning their tournaments, but it is not, I would say, uniform. One thing that Briar can't count on in this meta is that people like Dorinthia aren't going to turn around and do similar levels of damage back or threaten similar levels of damage back. Certainly Aria, being just as consistent as she ever was, can threaten the zero-cost Briars as well, though I don't know necessarily that they don't have the best matchup. I still feel like that zero-cost Briar list is pretty good. The only thing I will say is that Kano can put that list, on its ass, but it's a bit of a tricky one because Kano is actually losing much more heavily to newer heroes like Oldhim and Lexi running Heart of Ice than he has been previously. So there's kind of like, good and bad bits in there where, Kano is quite good against zero cost Briar, but is being balanced out a bit by Oldhim. And we'll also see, the Lexi decks with Ice coming in, Earth Briar, a bit of Earth Briar, and still a bit of chain going around. I've even seen some Duskblade chain lists, which is good. I expect that Duskblade is good if you're running into an Oldhim or something like that, and because it's Blitz, of course, you can just bring in alternatives and things like that. You can just bring in Duskblade because you have 11 equipment slots. Here's an interesting post I kind of wanted to read out and just talk about. So ever since UK Nationals, I've been observing some kind of problematic things in the Fab community that are a bit alarming to me, and I'm curious to dialogue on the subject. The biggest and most consistent being this weird problem I've observed in other TCGs too, like Magic, which is this sort of bandwagon ban loop. It starts with the construction and success of a new powerful deck, Lightning Briar. The reaction of the majority of players is then to immediately rush out to build and play said deck, yes. And by majority, I mean vast number of the player base. Well, 40 to 50% of certain large tournaments. And when this new deck becomes the majority of the meta, brackets and a thing entirely designed by the players, they turn around and label that deck as oppressive, degenerate, and call for pieces of it to be banned. If the company obliges the player base, rejoices at the company's decision, and proceeds to rinse and repeat. If they do not, the player base scoffs at the company and blame them for ruining their own game until a change occurs, like a new set or something, and we repeat the loop with a new deck. He just talks about the fact that he's seen it a lot with Briar, despite the fact that he's seen Briar struggling against certain builds like Ice Lexi, Oldhim, and Rhinar. Seen Briar not being as big a deal when it's only 40% of the meta at a specific tournament. But, obviously if a hero turns up with 40% of the field or 50% of the field, they're obviously going to be the majority of the top cut, even if the deck is, not as amazing as everyone says. And to be clear, the deck is very powerful. My point is that it's just isn't the ban-worthy bogeyman that Chain was a few short months ago. In many cases, it seems Briar distinctly has numbers on her side rather than sheer power level. I've also played against the deck, and while it raced it well, I definitely didn't feel I could not defeat it. Which brings me to my point in this whole post. I don't think the problem in the meta is the deck. I think it's a certain ingrained mentality that I would hope fab players could unlearn and break away from in order to help maintain a different and untimely better experience in the game. I suspect a lot of us are Magic players format. Yeah, not really. Though I am building a commander deck now, which is a dangerous prospect because I haven't played Magic in about 20 years, but I've decided that I want to build a Prosper tone-bound commander deck and play it with my brother and some other people. So, hopefully I do not get fully back into Magic, but as I say that, I do have a pile of Modern Horizons cards that I opened earlier today. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked. So I suspect a lot of us are Magic players, former or continued, but exploring other options too, who got sick of this exact kind of thing happening over and over again in that game, and we are generally migrating away from what has become a truly toxic environment. The trouble is, I think a lot of those players are carrying old habits into this game, not intentionally, of course, but incidentally due to the culture most of us have come from. Almost all of my experiences in fab events have been overtly positive, but I see a familiar point of concern budding in the community, and I worry. So is this a real thing? Am I concerned? Are you concerned? Is everyone concerned? So I think this is an interesting point to raise, right? Because TCGs do operate in this cycle of person discovers really broken, consistent deck. People switch to play that deck and then win with the deck. And then lots more people are playing that deck. And then ultimately there either is a meta counter or a meta shift, right? So a meta counter is when another deck comes about that has a good matchup into that deck and consistent matchups into other decks as well. So it becomes the next logical choice to play. And you see people switching from the first deck to the second deck, but not everyone will switch because they don't have all the cards and because the first deck still has good matchups into different types of heroes. But there will be a meta counter that leads the meta to balance out a little bit more. And the other thing that happens, of course, is a meta shift, which is just where you get a new set or a ban or something like that that then forces the meta to change in a different way. And those are kind of the two ways that metas progress in TCGs. The fact is that when you have a dominant deck, it is both a problem and not, and like a challenge, right? The problem is that yes, it is dominant, and once people get wind of that and they're going to a very large event like a calling or something like that, they want to play the best deck that is the least tiring. It's an important point. Zero's Briar is very easy to play in terms of mental energy and finishing rounds fast, but they also want to play a game that has proven a deck that has proven consistency and sort of drive themselves through to a position where they're going to have a positive win rate in the majority of their matchups, which Lightning Bride did until people started playing Ice Lexi and Oldhim. The only problem there is that Ice Lexi and Oldhim don't have that second requirement necessarily all the time in terms of a good enough matchup into other heroes in the same way that the Lightning Briar deck did, which meant they're not really encouraging a mass exodus, which is good. let's be honest, it's good. If everyone started playing Oldhim, then lots of events would go to draws and we'd have a much bigger problem. But the fact that only a few people are means that there is room for enough or a certain number of Oldhims in the meta before they start getting paired up a lot in round one and they get paired up against Briar players instead. So really, I want to kind of take a step back before we go into what needs to be done or what could be done, and before we start talking about our tier list properly, is to think about the playtesting process for a card game like this. And really, we kind of have to ask this big sort of burning question, which is, do we think that Lightning Briar was discovered in playtest and intended by the developers? Okay? And these two questions are very, very important. Because if Lightning Briar was discovered in playtest and seen, you know, in some form, maybe it wasn't as tuned as it is now, but at least in some form that was reasonably aggressive and was allowed to progress into the core of the main game, then that means that Lightning Briar, as it currently is designed to be as powerful as it is. Potentially because, for reasons like we saw with Chain, Briar is intended to be a main story hero for the future of whatever the Everfest Tales of Aria next storyline is, and therefore they wanted Briar to feel super powerful. Now, I mean, sensitivities as whether or not to make Runeblade super powerful again in a set just after Monarch was a sensible choice or not from the design team. We'll put that aside. The answer is obviously no, but we'll put that aside for a second and just talk about the fact that Briar was either seen and allowed or not seen and therefore got through under the radar, right? And that may be, and this is important, right? So Briar's text specifically doesn't care if the attack actions are elemental or not, but that doesn't mean that the developers, when they were making it, didn't test Briar as more of the earth builds that we know now, where they assumed and they built decks with elemental cards in them rather than testing them with these large amounts of generics. So it could be very possible for a small development team to do something which I call assuming text. It's assuming text that is on a card, which is when it isn't actually on a card. And I've seen it happen at small development teams who are working very, very close together, where they'll build a deck assuming a line of text is on a card because in their minds that's where it is, and they'll test that deck. And the line never gets added to the cards, right? And then it gets released and they're like, oh, wait a second, this breaks the game. Because in their minds, they're all too close to the project and they've skipped a line which basically says, oh, you know, to trigger Earth embodiment. Sorry, I was trying to remember the word. The attack has to be an elemental attack. It has to come, the damage has to come from an elemental source, right? And they could have built decks with that plan in mind, so they would have built the Earth build, which is much more balanced, and completely missed the Lightning build at all because it runs mostly on generics, and they wouldn't have wanted to play generic heavy decks. They would have wanted to test new cards that were coming in to see how the package worked together for new players and how that felt. And that can happen. Did it happen? We have no way of knowing. The real thing, right, and this is the big question, they may have seen that deck, but because they were testing in a semi-skewed environment where they were trying to also test Oldhim and Lexi at the same time, the deck may not have seemed massively overpowered because they would have been playing it into a lot of Ice Lexi, into a lot of Oldhim, and a lot of maybe older heroes just to see how it worked together. And if that was the case, they could immediately have made the meta shift that we are now seeing in the national championships, which is commented on in Nathan's post, where when a lot of Briar doesn't show up and Oldhims do and things like that, they can beat the Briar decks. And we saw the Canadian Nationals have a Lexi deck winning with Ice into a field of Briar as well. So they may have reached that meta faster because they were already testing new heroes versus new heroes and mixing older heroes in. And then so there's kind of multiple ways that things like this could happen. But really the core question that needs to be answered, which we won't really find an answer to, but it is the core question to focus on, is Lightning Briar intended or is it not? Okay? And, you know, was it a mistake, as in they forgot to add a line or they didn't realize how the generics, they didn't see it, or was it planned? Now, if it was planned, then we have to assume that it was planned for Lightning Briar to come in really strongly, get people excited about the new set, and then for heroes like Ice Lexi, Oldhim to come in and balance out the number of Lightning Briars. The issue then, and the real reason that this has become such a flare point for the community, is that if you're going to plan for that sort of correction to happen, you need to give more time between major events where the community can breathe and test the next meta out. Whereas really what happened was we had the deck debut at a calling a week before the UK Nationals. We had the UK Nationals take it a little bit, run with it up, and the deck that won. Then we had the next calling / US Nationals weekend, where everyone had had the deck for 2 weeks and was basically at the stage where they are adopting that deck and not practicing counters to the deck. Basically steamrolled it. And then we had the third week, which was the last week of Nationals, which were smaller events, where Briar didn't necessarily do as well. I think we can see that a little bit here. Still a lot of Briar, obviously, but if we look at the events that happened... okay, so Taiwanese Nationals still won, but Canadian Nationals was not. So the point is, right, and this is kind of to illustrate it, deck breaks 1 week here. UK Nationals, people are like, what the hell is this deck? Some people go in and try it straight away, and those guys are the ones that win. US Nationals happens, mass adoption of this deck, right? Still not taking every tournament. It's not going to take every tournament, especially if the good players in certain smaller events have a favorite hero. They're still going to play that and win, like Bolton Sabres, etc. And then we see it properly take off. 2 weeks later, everyone is winning with this deck, right? Now, if these had been an extra week apart, you may have seen more internal testing, teams figuring out, well, if I play Ice Lexi, if I play this, if I play that, then I can win this tournament. But we didn't really see that happen because the set was still very new and the tournaments happened in a very short span of time. The real question will be if we go into January before the new set comes out and we have the calling in Europe going ahead with 500 people, will there be a similar amount of these Cheerios, Briar deck wins, whatever you want to call it, decks, or will the meta have shifted further to see more Ice Lexi, more Oldhim countering those decks, entering the meta, more Chain, of course, who is still quite good, and lots of other options for handling that beyond just letting the deck run rampant everywhere. And here's the thing. This is what it all comes down to. If we see that shift, okay, then I would accept that Briar was seen as a deck during playtesting, but decided it was acceptable because of how the meta would shift afterwards, right? If we don't see that shift, and if the next whatever large event before Everfest comes out is still won by Lightning Briar, then my contention is going to be that actually the devs didn't see the deck list during playtesting. And I have a whole section I could do, but essentially we are reaching the point where the game is going to such a large audience that the amount of playtesters needed to successfully test the game is going to grow rapidly beyond what LSS can do in-house with the 10, 15, 20, whatever people, how many people they've got employed. The fact is that when these games only go to a niche market, it's a lot less likely that someone's going to discover the combination that's going to break the game. But once you start sending them out to hundreds of thousands of people, however many people play Flesh and Blood, do I believe it's 200,000? I'd like to believe it, but I'll accept a smaller number based on the 10,000 that are on the leaderboard in certain countries and things like that. But the point is that when they start going out to more and more people, more rigorous testing is needed because it's much more likely that someone is going to find that one thing you didn't see that actually secretly breaks the game, right? Whether it's Lightning Briar or just an interaction that causes a no-win situation or something like that, those things will start to happen more and more. And you need to start to have more rigorous testing. And I do think that there are clear signs in the Tales of Aria product that playtesting is not as rigorous as it is. We'll not just talk about the Duskblade ban, but also, there's some cards that feel like they could have been up-tuned a little bit or tweaked a little bit to work a bit better, which haven't been. And like maybe could have had a 3-block, should have had, 1 extra damage, 1 less damage, all those kind of little tweaks that would come out with even more playtesting. And also some cards which, to be honest, are just not exciting and don't really mesh with the core gameplay styles that the heroes want to play, which kind of just feel like draft fodder or whatever you want to call it. But, I feel like a better playtesting team would have given more critical feedback about some of the cards in this set. And I'm not giving examples for a reason, because it's kind of just a general feeling that I have, and feel free to disagree with it, but I at least think that that's the position I'm currently feeling at with Tales of Aria. The other thing, of course, that might have happened, which could be relevant, is that it is possible that the playtesting team, because of the short turnaround times, playtested Tales of Aria and the Everfest supplemental set together and then split them up after the fact, which means that the balanced environment that we're all seeking from Aria is actually supposed to come out with Everfest. Now, that seems like a crazy proposition, but what I want you guys to remember is that the national tournaments for this year were all supposed to be, from what I've heard, Monarch Meta events, right? The national championships were supposed to happen around the May, June, July summer period in the US and the UK, right? And Europe. The reason they didn't happen is because of COVID pushing everything back. So from my understanding, from talking to people around, the actual original meta for the national championships was supposed to be that Monarch meta that the RTNs were in, but everything got delayed, and that's why we ended up playing Tales of Aria meta. Now, it is possible, right? And this is kind of where I think, in terms of the planning for these sets, is that Monarch was balanced around Constructed, because that was meant to be the Road to Nationals meta. The National Championships meta. Tales of Aria's balanced around Draft, because we have a break, and not sealed. We're not going to call Tales of Aria sealed balanced. Quote me on that, at me, whatever. I don't care. The meta for sealed Tales of Aria is absolutely trash. It's Briar or go home. And to be fair, even the drafting side of things is kind of questionable, because this set is really bad at sending signals. I keep giving the reference that it's kind of like playing the Game of Thrones board game, or one of those high strategy board games where if you have one weak player who doesn't draft very well, the whole draft gets skewed in terms of signals, and people will just draft 5 of the same heroes sitting next to each other, right? I've seen it happen. And if you've designed a set which can't send clear signals, that is not a good draft set. But that's another tangent aside. You can see that they've clearly balanced Tales of Aria with draft in mind, right? Because it might have been meant to be our draft set interlude between the CC constructed calling meta in the summer into a draft and sealed meta with a bit of CC mixed in the winter, and then into Everfest coming out in January or February, leading into the new constructed meta callings, ProQuests, everything happening then, and the new nationals, which is probably going to happen fairly early next year because it was delayed. So you could see Road to Nationals starting around April or May. That would then be the new meta, would involve both Tales of Aria and Everfest as the constructed meta. So when I'm saying this kind of like speculation that maybe those two sets were tested together from a constructed perspective and then split up, that's kind of what I'm basing it on, is this delay in timelines and that kind of thing that might have led to the wrong metas that they've practiced for coinciding with the wrong events that they didn't intend to be primarily in that format, right? And that's just a thought for you to consider, an interesting takeaway, that maybe due to the fact that COVID delayed things, actually we were supposed to have a chain versus prism dominated national meta into a draft focused Aria, into an Everfest plus Tails CC Road to Nationals calling meta part 2 2022. And that's quite interesting to think about. So now that we've had a bit of a spec and sort of discussion, we are going to talk about tier lists. Let's just grab... Okay, now I'm going to change this a bit because I do not want that. I just want one. Yeah. I don't want an S tier. I don't think any of these heroes are S tier. We're going to have 1.5. We're going to have 2. And we're going to have 3. I guess we can have 2.5. And we'll have trash. I'm not going to have... Well, we'll see. We'll see where people get up. We'll have 3 and we'll have Don't Play This Hero. So, obviously, Briar just goes right up here, okay? Tier 1 deck. Both the Earth and the Lightning decks have both been winning at national championships and at the calling. It's kind of just worth acknowledging that. And the fact that Briar has 2 to 3 variable decks, if you count the Blossoming Spellblade version, which is a bit more defensive and controlly, is enough to justify her being a tier 1 deck, because your opponent never really knows what they're going to sit down against. Okay, next up we have... Now, I keep doing this, and you guys don't like it, because I put Rhinar quite high up. We haven't really seen Rhinar winning any large events, really. But he does, he has had a somewhat good matchup into the Briar decks that have been coming out. He came second at the French Nationals. Well-piloted Rhinar does well into the field, does get edged out by Lightning Briar's aggressiveness, but what can you do? Next up, let's take Katsu. Now, Katsu did actually win a Nationals in the end, which was quite funny. He won the Finnish Nationals, which only had 20 players, and not as much Lightning Briar as other decks. The sad and ultimate truth is that Katsu can't compete with Lightning Briar in terms of aggro, and the control version is reasonably good, but it doesn't necessarily put out the level of damage that it needs to do in order to win. So where is Katsu right now? I'm putting Katsu... Ooh, that's supposed to be tier 2 down here, right? Not tier 2.5. Let's not be that mean to Mr. Katsu. Right, so let's put him down at 2.2. Then we have Dorinthia. Now, Dorinthia is here. Easy enough to talk about Dorinthia. She hasn't really had a good showing at any of the tournaments this year. She might even be potentially down here, primarily because of the fact that Prism is still kicking around. But also, like, Lightning Briar has a reasonably good matchup into Dorinthia, so, it's a bit tricky to say, oh, Dorinthia is bad. She did make the final of 1 Nationals. Or was it 2? I think she made the final of Spain and Switzerland. Yeah, so she's not terrible. And she won Norway, well, that's interesting. But, she's not necessarily the best performing at the moment. She could probably earn her spot up at rank 2. Then we've got Dash. I'm still putting Dash up here. I think a well-piloted Dash deck can beat many of these zero-cost Briar decks. I feel like, it's got a lot of reach in the deck. I definitely happily put it up there. I think, so just to sort of reiterate the tiers again, in case people are getting lost. So the tier 1 decks are just like the best decks in the meta. The tier 1.5 decks are almost the best decks in the meta, but they're just slightly not as reliable or not as tuned in a way that makes them harder to win consistently, and they might lose to the tier 1 decks slightly more often than not, but they probably still have good matchups against other tier 1.5 and lower decks. Tier 2 decks are decent but not consistently performing, good but can't necessarily push on the gas and win an event the same way that a tier 1 or tier 1.5 deck can do. They sometimes perform well with very good pilots. They can beat the decks at the top, but they're not necessarily always going to be able to push through as consistently. And tier 2.5 decks are usually a gimmick-based deck that can win if someone has a very, very good run with them. So think like OTK decks or Data Doll, item spam deck, like that kind of level, like Kano or stuff like that, where, yes, if they get really lucky and they have a really good run, they could potentially win an event, but they're not consistently expected to win events. Third on my list, we have Bravo. Bravo's still going down here. It's important to understand, though, that the gap between 1 and 1.5 is not as high as between, like, S and A tier. Like, Briar is beatable with all of these decks that are going in this list. The only thing, really, is that Briar has a better win rate against these guys and all of these guys together than these do specifically against everyone, including Briar as well. Azalea's just, yeah, whatever. Don't play Azalea. I keep memeing. I think she did make the top 8 at a tournament. Maybe I'm telling a lie. No, she didn't. Azalea just suffers from the problem of just not being particularly good. Her arrows aren't as good. She doesn't have as many of them as Lexi does. She finds it hard to get go again, which means she's putting out these big buffed attacks that are actually reasonably easy to block. She got a bit of a boost from Monarch, but she's not consistently performing in a way that lets her win. Prism is just getting smacked around the place by everyone. She had a decent showing in a few top 8s, but she just doesn't really... She's even a contender for down here. She's one of those heroes that offers a lot on paper and threatens a lot, but for some reason just keeps consistently failing to deliver at every event that she goes to. bar one or two notable examples. But as we've talked about before, those fall into specific meta counters. So, you know, it's like if you win with Oldhim when the field is 60% Lightning Briar, does that make Oldhim a tier 1 hero, or does it mean that Oldhim has a really good matchup into Lightning Briar but loses against all the other tier 1.5 decks and therefore isn't a tier 1 hero, it's just a meta call? And Prism kind of had the same thing. Then we have Levia. I'm still putting Levia up here. Had a top placing, a reasonable number of events, which was good. Had like some really good games into all of these people, including Lightning Briar a bit. So actually Levia performing reasonably well. And I think it's one of those things that Levia suffers from the opposite problem that Lightning Briar does, which is she has incredibly low representation, which means that every game she wins is a struggle. You know, if you had an extra 10 or 15 Levia players at every event, you might see her more consistently reaching the higher scores, but it's very hard for her to do that when obviously she's fighting an uphill battle in terms of not having enough people. Then we have Chain. Really tempting to put Chain back on the tier 1 side of things. He is just very consistent and very flexible, but I will say that he loses consistency over his previous decks, and that consistency loss is what relegates him to tier 1.5. I'm not sorting through all the Blitz heroes. We have Bolton. He can go in here. Okay, will Bolton go in here? I mean, Bolton won a calling against Orinthia. Bolton has an interesting matchup into Lightning Briar because he can essentially block a lot of her damage and then get a combo. And if he still has enough life when the combo goes off, he can actually win. So there's an argument you could put him up here, but I still think he's a tier 2 hero because his matchups into these other champions aren't necessarily that great. And he just hasn't really demonstrated a performance consistently across all of these tournaments. Then we have Kano. Kano's got a gimmick. He's not consistently performing. He just goes down there. Then we have Viserai. Viserai is either here or here. I've really been impressed with Viserai in terms of how it's playing. Its matchups into other heroes. Matt Rogers picked it and played it very, very well. In fact, I think that Viserai suffers from being a deck that is very complex and being a Runeblade, which a lot of people who are playing Runeblade are just playing Briar, right? Why waste your time learning Viserai if Briar exists? But if you look at the video that I did with Hamish, you know, if you look at the video I did with Hamish recently on his Viserai deck, there is a lot of reach and a lot of power and flexibility in Viserai that allows him to prepare himself for different matchups in a lot of ways, which really does catapult him to the higher tier of decks, and I think could potentially earn him a slot as a tier 1 deck. But I will say, and I will caveat this, that Viserai player is going to have to work and practice so much harder than the Briar players just to get the performance. It will pay off if you invest the time, but it's hard to guarantee that you're going to invest the time and win all the time. You know, you have a good matchup, but it's not a win rate matchup. But I think Viserai is definitely the dark horse pick to win a large event soon, and a lot of good players are testing him to push forward into a really good meta. Then we have Lexi up here, maybe. I mean, if we look at the way Lexi has performed, right? She wasn't solved up here. People were trying her, but no one was really consistent. Then you have something like the German Nationals happens. There are 2 Ice Lexi deck lists in there that do really well, and people start thinking maybe I can play Lexi. Then we see Lexi show up at almost every single other Nationals that happen. You know, there's a few that she's missing from, but quite a few of the Nationals have Lexi involved. And she won the Canadian Nationals, which had 80 players, right? Now, Lexi has a deck that has evolved through this meta, right? Getting us to a stage where she is actually doing quite well now. And really, it's quite interesting because you would see Lexi evolve even more, I think, if there were a few more weeks of a CC or national meta that would give Lexi more of a scope to take on Lightning Briars, but also has a good matchup into lots of other heroes. So Lexi is a contender up here like Viserai. Like, we could potentially just make our tier 1 list a bit more generous, and we could put these 4 heroes up here because I think they all have a lot of game maybe even Chain as well. I think they all have a lot of game into the field, but don't necessarily have a lot of game all the time. But I mean, I'm content leaving a nice big tier 1.5 and just letting the data about the number of Lightning Briar players kind of speak for itself on that front. Then we have Oldhim. Oldhim is a tricky hero because if everyone's playing Oldhim, then he's down here because every game is tied. If everyone's playing Lightning Briar, then he's up here beating the Lightning Briars into oblivion. His matchups into other heroes aren't necessarily great or bad, but he can win. And we have seen him win one event. We have seen him start to place a lot higher, and obviously he won the Calling as well, which was a 500-person event. But I don't know if he faced that many Bravos except in the top cut. And I have heard it reported that that top cut Bravo game took 2 hours to finish, which obviously he wouldn't have had time to do if he wasn't playing in the top cut of an event. And that's the big question mark about Oldhim that keeps making me slide him further down. Because I personally think Oldhim is one of the better heroes in the set. I think he's a really good answer to Briar, Lexi, and a few of the other heroes on this list. And I'm really tempted to put him up against 1.5. But Oldhim actually suffers from what I call the Kano problem, which is if no one is playing Kano, no one runs Null Rune, and therefore Kano can win and moves up to 1.5. If everyone is playing Kano, then Kano can't win because everyone has Null Rune, and he moves back down to 2.5. If everyone's playing Oldhim, there's a lot of timed games, a lot of draws, so Oldhim moves down to a 2.5 because you can't consistently win with a hero that's drawing. It just doesn't work. If not that many people are playing Oldhim, if everyone's playing aggro decks and you just don't get paired against that many Bravos, and you go up against, Chain and Lexi and Viserai and Briar, then Oldhim can legitimately just smash face. And I've been playing Oldhim a lot recently, and that's kind of how it's played out. So there we go. That's kind of like my tier list. Obviously, people always disagree with me. People are like, oh, Katsu's bad, but then he won a Nationals. So, what can I say, dude? I put Katsu as a tier 1 deck. And my tier 1 list from last video was Briar, Dorinthia, Katsu, and Prism, I think, at the top. And then Reinhardt and the others down here. Maybe I had Dash and Bravo at the top. But I've kind of switched it up a little bit. And I will say that I'm much more comfortable with this list because it's based on data, whereas the other one was based on speculation. And I think this is much more fair list. I do think that when we have our next large CC event, Lightning Briar is probably going to be taken down a peg. I would expect to see a lot more Oldhims, Viserais, and Lexis, and a lot more Chain as well. And quite a few of the Lightning Briar players pivoting to Chain or Viserai. And the reason I say that is that Lightning Briar is a great deck for delivering power, but it does lack a decent amount of flexibility when it comes... Now, it doesn't need flexibility because it just slaps face, but it does lack a bit of flexibility when it comes to having different game plans. If it's not, if it's getting fatigued or something like that, it can't necessarily switch it up as easy as other decks can. And one of the things you saw about the European Briar decks who play into a lot more control is that actually, they started to load up more on blues. And if you look at Christian Franco's deck, which came from the French Nationals, you'll actually see that he upped his blue count a lot more than the original deck. The original deck had about, I think, 6 blues main deck, and Christian switched it up to running 14, which is closer to aggro Katsu levels. And one of the reasons he did that was so he could run Evergreen and also pitch a blue, make a rune chant, and swing with the sword. Because when Lightning Briar has to play against control decks regularly, you have to change how Lightning Briar plays. And that creates an opening for someone like Chain to come back in or Viserai to come back in, and also creates an incentive for those Lightning Briar players to switch to playing one of the other Runeblades. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope the initial talk was enlightening. I hope you don't disagree with my tier list too much, but if you do, dislike the video and give me a ranting post in the comments. I will be more than happy to listen to you. As always, if you liked this video and you've listened this far, please do like and subscribe. I do also have a Ko-fi page, which is linked in the description for people who want to support me on a more ongoing basis. I do have plans for the Ko-fi page in terms of setting up a Discord, giving out more deck lists and more advice, and playing games with people who subscribe on there. But as it is at the moment, there's 3 subscribers. I appreciate you all so much, but I kind of need a few more to justify the amount of time it will take me to start fleshing out that stuff even more, as there is just a one-man show going on here. And as you can tell, I've recorded this video. I've also recorded 5 other videos this week for my new player hero guide series, and I have another 10 to go, I think. So, you know, I'm really enjoying making that, but it's obviously eating up a lot of my video making time. But I've been getting so much positive feedback about it, that I'm really going to continue. I've had new players messaging me being like, I was absolutely lost about what hero to play. I watched your guide and it was fantastic. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks you all for watching. And as always, you know, I'm Steelfur. This has been Steelfur Supremacy, Steelfur Speaks, whatever you want to call me. I don't really mind as long as you watch the videos. Have a great evening.